Okay. Welcome everybody. Just going to give a couple minutes before we begin just to let people kind of fill in. All right. Got about 54 attendees so far. Welcome everybody as you're coming in to this webinar series of how to ensure equitable development as we rebuild. This is the third part of a webinar series that we community science are putting on just to really see what the response is around COVID-19 as well as equity community development in general and how those two kind of interplay with each other. Just given a few more minutes, see if we get a few more people, and I will go ahead and begin. Well, more like a few more seconds. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, this is the third installment of our webinar series. And before we continue, I just want to introduce a few housekeeping things about GoToWebinar. So as you all enter, everyone is muted, but we are accepting questions, and we do encourage questions. So please, as the panelists are speaking or as Amy is introducing the topic, feel free to enter your questions in the chat provided in the GoToWebinar Manager. You can also, if you want a little bit more room on your screen, you can use your red arrow there and it'll kind of open and close the panel. This webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing the recording back to you all in about a day. And afterwards, we will also send a list of resources so you can kind of follow up with any of the panelists or see some of the things that they're all working on or any other resources that might come up through the conversation. We also have a handout of the panelist bios as well as the PowerPoint slides. If you want to download those, they'll be available throughout the entirety of the webinar. That is found in there should be a handouts kind of drop-down menu in your webinar manager. So feel free to download those as we go through. And of course, if there are any technical issues or anyone needs some assistance, can't hear, whatever it may be, my colleague Evelyn Hetzel will be monitoring those, and you'll see her email right here at the bottom. So please feel free to reach out to her if you're having any issues with hearing any of us or trying to figure out exactly how to set yourself up on the GoTo. Okay, so today I am co-moderating here with Amy Minsner, both from Community Science. Well, I'm in the office today, but Amy will be working remote, coming in from Maine. And we will be going over, today's agenda is really the introduction to equitable development, a brief introduction of the panelists, and then we'll really get into the panel discussion. And of course, we will pause for those audience questions. So please, please, please keep putting those in as we go. Before we begin, I would like to, however, just kind of get a sense of who's in the room today, who's joining us. So we have a quick poll, which you all should be seeing pop up on the screen now. If you can take quick 15-30 seconds, just leave this up and we'll allow the audience members to please weigh in on where you're coming from today and which institution or organization really describes you best. And let's give a few more seconds for people to kind of weigh in. So far, we have quite a few community-based nonprofits or CDFIs, good chunk of researchers and evaluators. Little less on the other three responses. Okay, let's go ahead and see where we're at. So as you can see here, Really, a majority of community-based nonprofits or CDFIs, as well as researchers, evaluators, or academic institutions. But welcome all of you, and thank you for joining today. Okay, and with that, I would like to kick it over to Amy, who will introduce the topic.
Hello, everyone. I am really excited to be here speaking with you all today with these wonderful panelists. Daniel, thank you for the introduction and all of the organization and housekeeping that you've done. We as a panel thought it would be helpful to start with a discussion, a brief introduction to the concept of equitable development. It is definitely one of those terms that is used a lot, and it's not always clear if we all use the same definition. So we thought we'd start with a grounding and make sure you're hearing the panelists from the perspective of which they're coming. So at first, at a high level, before, there's a lot of words on the screen, but at a high level, I thought it might be helpful to just summarize, really equitable development is about working to improve neighborhoods or districts, both the places and also the lives of those living in those places. And so taking that as a high level, then we think about delving deeper in. We, as a panel, liked this definition of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and Policy Link. If any of you are here on the phone, we're very grateful for the work that you do. And we adapted it a bit based on our experiences and also the COVID-19 reality we're facing. So first, thinking about ensuring public and private investments, programs, and policies are guided by and also meet the needs of residents, particularly communities of color and also low wealth communities. Equitable development also focuses on reducing disparities, taking into account racial disparities, taking into account past history and current conditions. When it's successful, equitable development leads to quality of life improvement in outcomes, for example, affordable housing and living wage employment, and that those are equitably experienced, both by those currently living and working in the neighborhood and also any new people moving in. So as we think about equitable development after COVID-19, the immediate conversation is less about how to protect residents from current negative effects of gentrification, which likely would have been almost the entirety of our conversation in January. But now it's also about how do we spur positive recovery, future development, and also lay the groundwork to put in place protections to avoid decisions now that will spur gentrification pressures in the future. For example, making decisions now to decrease the likelihood that neighborhood property can be purchased for future speculation. This work is critical because we know that residents and business owners are going to be facing high levels of unemployment, residual debt from the crisis, at risk of eviction, foreclosure, bankruptcy, and also that municipalities, states, and federal government are going to be facing very hard choices with their resources. There's a recent study out where nearly all municipalities are projecting a deficit at the moment. And these are going to continue due to reduced sales tax, reduced revenues, reduced property tax payments, as also the funds that they're using now for public health crisis, that they're going to have to figure out how they're going to pay that money that they used for these needs. We also know that these challenges are being faced in every community and in every household, but they're experienced very differently at higher and deeper rates in communities of color and low wealth communities, which have been affected by the virus at higher rates. They also are starting from a more vulnerable position, particularly communities of color, due to past and present racist policies that deprived capital in neighborhoods and also diminished employment opportunities. So for our conversation today, we want to wrestle with these issues, and these amazing panelists are here to share from their experiences working on equitable development for many years. As we prepared for this session and did kind of some initial conversations, got to know each other, got to hear about experiences, there were three themes that emerged that I think you'll start to hear in our conversation today. The first is the critical importance of planning for the future and not just the present crisis. Another one is protecting what you've already won. If you've been in the fight for equitable development, how do you protect and not lose ground in this time? And then third, how can you increase local control and ownership for the future? The panelists are going to work to operationalize these ideas based on what they have implemented and what they're currently working toward in their communities and with their constituents. And before we dive into that, we wanted to touch briefly on conflict and share a few principles from conflict transformation to support your work. This is useful because for all of these strategies we discussed today, critical choices are going to be required. How resources will be allocated and what or who will be prioritized. For example, will preferential access be allowed to small business funding and TA programs for founders of color? Or might it be that a tax is going to be passed to avoid land speculation? Might it be that staff time needs to be reallocated between neighborhoods, or also that certain programs need to be reduced? In those choices, conflict is elevated. And rightly so, neighborhood residents and organizations are also elevating conflict to make sure that the needs of their communities are considered and addressed. In this environment, principles of conflict transformation can move us, which move us beyond immediate resolution of conflict and focus more on root causes, can be a tool toward equitable outcomes. The principles on the screen are adapted from the work of John Paul Lederach, which were developed in an international context, but there are practitioners that are using them in community here in the United States. The first one is conflict and complexity hold great opportunity. And I think the key lesson here is don't shy away from the conflict. It is present, and working through it, opportunities emerge. Nora has an example that she'll share about some of how there was some apparent conflict and they've worked through that in forming allies. There's also relationships can change the trajectory of conflict. By knowing and understanding the experiences and motivations, new solutions can emerge. This has been seen particularly between old and new residents or unlikely allies in a fight for justice. The third is, I use quotation marks because this is actually one of John Paul Lederach's principles. And so often it was in a violent conflicts internationally, but it still resonated here because there's often systemic violence that has happened in the past, and the importance of actually working toward justice in the work that we're doing in equitable development so that real change can happen. And finally, planning for linear, so planning to have a direct plan, but also knowing that with conflict, we circle and we make progress and we circle back and we make progress, and knowing to not give up the fight and not to feel that it's lost, but that we have to continue to persevere. So those things may come up in the conversation, we may return to them, but I wanted to share that for those of you particularly working in community or funding work in community, to think about how using the conflict that is inherent in this time is productive and laying groundwork for true success. And with that, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves. I think Lot, you're first.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. Pleasure being here with everyone. My name is Lautaro. Everybody calls me Lot Diaz. I work for a national organization called Unidos US. It was formerly known as National Council of La Raza for many years. We've been around for 50 years and been fighting in various ways and levels for equitable rights for Latinx communities all across the country. Specifically, we do it, we have a unique platform. We have over nearly 300 partner organizations across the country, and we do use that network plus any work that we're doing federally to do a couple things. We leverage, we focus, we identify and leverage local communities to support federal legislation and sometimes state legislation that is going to have a dramatic impact in our community. That's done from anywhere from local advocacy to get out the vote and voter registration activities, and all of the sense of mobilizing communities to kind of support the issues that are critical to them as they progress in this country. The second thing we do is that we do programs, innovations through program deployment, and that's kind of where been my work primarily. We're one of HUD's largest HUD housing counseling intermediaries. We have a large financial coaching platform for communities. And in addition, I am on the board of National Community Stabilization Trust, which is, I'll talk about below, but has been involved through a previous crisis and currently is still operating and may become relevant in this one. We created a nonprofit specifically to do a variety of things, and I'll focus on that. my comments here are going to really focus on wealth, the impact of wealth and a family's wealth throughout both the past crisis and the implication of it through the current crisis. There's some examples and specific things I think communities have to look out for because it was amazing what happened through the last crisis, and it's not a far-fetched idea that a similar thing may happen this time. And I think it's something we all should pay attention to.
Thank you, Lot. Nora?
Hi, my name is Nora Lichtash, and I work in Philadelphia, with a group that we call WCRP, Women's Community Revitalization Project. We have a two-part mission. Oh, I should say we were started about 35 years ago by a group of women, all of whom lived, worked, or worshiped in a neighborhood in North Philly, and I was one of them. We've always had a two-part mission. The first part is that we build buildings, and this will also kind of tell you where we do our work. Mostly we've built residential. We've built and managed 300 deeply affordable rental homes, and we've done that in both North and South Philly. But the second part of our mission is equally important, and it's to support and build the leadership of all of us who are doing this work. And we do that through organizing and advocacy campaigns to push for better policies, primarily around housing and land or land use. And some of this work happens in the neighborhoods, but most of it is done citywide in coalitions that we staff. And our most recent work is a Development Without Displacement campaign. We won it after 4 years, and it created $100 million, new dollars that are going into our city's housing trust fund. In addition to the money, that campaign built a lot of leadership that gets us ready for what next. We did not envision this as what is next, but we feel like we're ready.
Thank you, Nora. Shad?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Shad Henderson. I'm with Neighborhood Allies, a community development intermediary in Pittsburgh. First, I want to say thank you to Community Science for having me on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. It's a great opportunity and looking forward to the discussion. So, Neighborhood Allies, we've been in existence for about 5 years now, and we have the mission to support the people, the organizations, and partnerships created that's committed to creating and maintaining healthy neighborhoods. We have a focus on people and place. From a place-based perspective, we work in 6 different neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are primarily African American and low income. And what we do at the neighborhood level is we really work to focus deep relationships in the neighborhood. We listen to figure out how we can best serve as an ally. And we also make financial investments, whether it be grants, through loans of that nature. From a people-based perspective, we focus on the regional level. We realize that a lot of the vulnerable residents that we work with are very transient. They could live in one neighborhood to another neighborhood on a daily basis. So from that point of view, we focus on affordable housing and economic opportunity from a regional perspective. And as far as internally within our organization, I would say equitable development is embedded in our DNA, in a sense that we have strong commitment from our board all the way down to our staff to have an equity lens in how we approach this work. So again, thank you for allowing me to serve on this panel.
Wonderful. Great. So let's dive in. Our first question, and we're going to have all 3 panelists answer this question, is from your experience, what strategy, policy, or program holds the greatest promise for advancing equitable development as we recover and rebuild from the pandemic? And I asked the panelists to speak from their experience about either to think about what they've what they've experienced so far, and also kind of how they're thinking about moving forward. So we're going to start with Nora.
In our work, also I'm not used to talking to 111 people, so I'm going to look down at my notes and look up, but I know what I'm saying. So in our work, we've had 2 strategies pretty much throughout: winning land, or trying to ensure that land is used fairly, and winning money so that that land can be developed. And our coalitions have been pretty broad, to include groups that care about affordable housing, especially affordable accessible housing, food access and food justice, and good living wage jobs. And in a coalition that that was a strong coalition called the Campaign to Take Back Vacant Land. We fought for the creation of a land bank in our city. And through our organizing, we were involved in drafting the legislation that created it. And what we cared about were three things, three key factors, that it would be fair, transparent, and accountable. And that the land bank would be able to consolidate land that was owned by multiple agencies that was publicly held, and also cheaply take tax delinquent land, because there was a lot of it, and then give it back out for both market uses and equitable development. So we won that campaign, although we're still trying to hold the land bank accountable. And so that's land, and we feel like there's some potential there for the future. Our last campaign I mentioned in my explanation of who I am and what my organization does. We want a construction impact tax. And, you know, we know that the construction in our neighborhoods, especially with market values increasing, has an impact on us. So that's why we called it a construction impact tax. And what it meant was that 1% of the cost of all new construction and substantial rehab would be required to go into our city's housing trust fund. And that legislation was passed by council, but our mayor threatened to veto it. So there was a compromise where the mayor committed to provide that $100 million in 5 years to the city's, from the city's general fund into the housing trust fund. And that was the first time the city put any of its own money into housing. So where we're going next may not be to fight for new resources, but just as Amy said, we need to hold on to those ones that are committed, because the mayor's budget that came out last week said that he wasn't going to put that money in that was committed. And we're really thinking about what's in the future as it relates to land and permanent affordability.
Is there anything, Nora, you want to say briefly about the work you're doing to make sure to organize for making sure the money stays in the budget? Is there anything about coalitions or anything that would be useful?
You know, normally you can't win a campaign and then organize again around that same campaign because it just doesn't have energy. This has so much energy. People are so angry that that commit was made after a 4-year campaign, and then the mayor is taking it back out as if housing isn't an important issue under COVID and into the future. So there's some really exciting tactics that are socially distanced, but that could really embarrass. Oh, I guess the other thing is that city council is on our side and also really angry. And we built so much power during that initial campaign that we have a lot of support from council to push back on the budget.
Great, thank you. And if folks are interested in this topic, definitely add some questions and we'll see if we can get to them later. Okay, I think next we're gonna go to Lot.
Sure, thank you. So this is a very broad topic, and a lot of things that our organization works for goes around different threads around this thing. But what I'm gonna focus on is kind of the wealth stripping that happened last time, programs that were developed to kind of slow that down, and something to keep in mind going forward. So if you look back from 2007, 2015, in communities of color, Hispanic communities, 20% of the homes, in Hispanic communities, 20% of the homes were foreclosed on in many areas, although they only comprised about 10% of the ownership. For African Americans, it was 13%, although they comprised only a little less than 8%. So you see the disparate view on that, and where that becomes a huge problem is that 45% of the wealth around for both those communities is embedded in their home equity. When that was lost, undoubtedly, and you saw, many of you have seen the numbers, the dramatic numbers around that, that it was a huge transfer of wealth. And so the question, where'd it go, right? Where'd that wealth go? And we were involved, we're on the, like I said, we're a sponsor of National Community Stabilization Trust, as well as we formed a community development corporation to buy and sell REO and distressed mortgage notes, which are families that are way behind, but the banks are selling them anyway just to get rid of them and take them off their own balance sheets. And what happened during these processes, we saw this whole thing pass, and it was just amazing. Over 10 million families, over 10 million homes were foreclosed on during the crisis, right? Which is a huge number. And of that amount, I'd say 95 or 96% of them went to private investors, right? What did the private investors do? a large majority rented them to get income for 5 years, and then at some formula they're going to sell it to get in the profit, right? So you see from dire circumstances that families faced during that period were converted into wealth and profit opportunities for private investors. You see that all that wealth transfer went from there to here, right? And it was systemically, it was cooked in systemically. It was probably the saddest thing I've seen in my career that I experienced directly. So the question is, what happened during that? Everybody, and it was also an issue very few people focused on, I will honest. Organizers, everybody, later on in the game, organizers and others became to notice the problem, but the data on this is like arcane and it's buried, and the data is not really good, so looking's really hard. You literally have to be in the game of transacting these assets to see how it was played. And so what we did was, during the crisis, lenders had programs where they tried to keep families in the home by selling it back to them at a very discounted price. They had programs that, similar to nonprofits, local nonprofits who are mission oriented and want to preserve housing. And they'd even some of them sold the distressed notes from families who were not foreclosed, but were severely delinquent. And so they were a very small portion. FHA had another program, small portion of the portfolio. FHA had a program. It had no impact because they had no discounts. We had to compete with with the investors, and I want to say a little bit about that, but in a second. And then, so the point is, there were programs developed. NCST was formed during that period, and it was a critical institution that was partnering with lenders on certain and federal agencies on one side, and local nonprofits and developers on the other side, and acting as a transfer point for assets from this side to the other side, right? And not surprisingly, the ones that went to the other side, that is into local hands, their outcomes were substantially better. I mean, families stayed in their home more, a greater percentage, and then even if foreclosure did happen, those homes didn't go into rental in some large portfolio for investor. They became a new home ownership opportunity for families in that community. So that operation, when we had an organization doing a similar thing during that whole time. For example, we did probably about 1,800 REO properties. We converted from either donation or purchase from a lender or servicer into a new home ownership opportunity for what we called income qualified, which for us was under 100% AMI. But usually most of it was in the 80 to 60%. And so that process was an innovation policy-wise that was within that whole context of complete destruction. And the reason I think it's relevant now is because the pandemic is putting similar pressures on homeowners. They've lost their job and they're delinquent. There are programs that are helping that out, absolutely. But there is going to come a point of time where, the payment comes due, so to speak, right? And where families are, where individuals are, is really uncertain, as uncertain as this pandemic. Is it going to be over by the end of the summer? Is it going to extend to the end of the year? Is business, all those variables that are really big unknowns, that risk is being pretty much absorbed by every family in this country. And so what we're fearing, and why we think the experience was important, because what we don't want to see happen is that same transfer of wealth from the communities of color and their either their home ownership, or in some cases small rental properties that they're owning and renting to families, transferring over to large portfolios of private investors who then again take a further control of the mortgage market. Of the housing market. There's a kind of a concept that's been floating around called commoditization of housing, right? And the process that happened during the crisis is a classic example that you took home ownership, wealth building assets that were in people's houses, and you turned them into a rental property to maximize revenue from that asset. Classic case of commoditization of housing. And what we're worried about, that same process will occur this time, and we want to do everything to stop it.
And so thank you a lot. And I think we have another question for you later that I think we can follow up on, like what the recommendations are going forward. So let's pause that right there, but we'll come back to that. And Shad, if you could share with us from back to our question about sort of what strategy, policy, or program holds the greatest promise for advancing equitable development where you work.
Sure, yes. So I would say what we're focused on right now is the collective impact model that's really focused on equity. I imagine most of us are familiar with collective impact, where you have a backbone and organization, shared measurements, common agenda, things like that. But we recently came across a report from Policy Link. It's actually from 2015, I believe, but it's called Equity, the Soul of Collective Impact. And I'll share that with everyone, but we think it's phenomenal. And I just really want to read a quote from that report really quickly. I promise I won't read a lot, but it says, equity, both racial and economic, must be infused through all aspects of collective impact processes, from the deep engagement of communities to the collection and analysis of data, the design and scale of solutions, and the capacities, point of view, and roles of backbone organizations. So that's one thing that we try to do. Anytime we're working in a neighborhood doing collective impact, making sure that community voice is centered. From a policy perspective, one of the things that we launched in Pittsburgh about 4 years ago was it's called All in Pittsburgh. And again, we received a lot of support from Policy Link. They're one of my favorite organizations for sure. They came to Pittsburgh. They helped us to do a report. They helped us to find a common definition of equitable development in Pittsburgh, because there were so different interpretations and things of that nature. So one of the things that we did was it took 3 years, but we were able to get equity legislation passed in the city of Pittsburgh. And this was huge. In Pittsburgh, there was a lot of research reports done about equity. And when we started on this mission, we heard loud and clear from the community, we don't need another damn report, excuse my language. We need action. So we finally, got the legislation passed, and it's key because it requires directors of city government to submit their equity plans and how it's attached to their budgets. And we really wanted to embed it in city government because there were equity or community benefits agreements wins neighborhood by neighborhood, but it was very uneven. And we wanted to have it embedded in city government so we could really reach the scale of the problem. And from a programmatic level, I wanted to share some information. We have this, it's called a shared real estate talent program, because at the neighborhood level, in Pittsburgh, there's a lack of capacity to do real estate development. And we know that we want neighborhoods a critical part of it. And neighborhood groups, while they would hire expertise in real estate development, those individuals wouldn't stay. They would go to the private market or things like that. So we really created this to be able to deploy real estate professionals into communities that can serve as their ally. And also, it's more of a sustainable model regional wide, where we can deploy real estate professionals, capital, loans, things like that, where there's a real opportunity. And it's been very successful. The real estate professionals, there's one community in Pittsburgh, it's called the Larmer neighborhood, where predominantly African American, a lot of seniors, where they brokered a deal with the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh, which is the huge economic engine city government within city government. And they brokered the deal where any transfer of publicly owned land in that neighborhood, the LCG has to sign off on it. And they were also a part of the community engagement. So we're really looking forward to expanding that model in the different neighborhoods. It's kind of in the pilot phase right now, but we see a lot of potential in it. Another program that we have is a partnership. Yes.
I'm thinking maybe we should move on to the next question. Okay. That you gave some really great tangible examples, and I think probably we can come back to that experience. So we heard about, I like the way you framed it, Nora, about, winning land and winning resources to do that work. The idea of avoiding wealth stripping, we'll definitely talk more about that throughout our panel. And Shad, the idea of really having a common definition of what equitable development is and getting agreements and then tying that into policies and programs so that it isn't something you have to fight every single time. So let's talk a little bit about conflict. We talked about that it needing to be increased, or not needing to be, but it does increase in these times. It's always present when we talk about development, and it's even more so now. And I asked Nora and Shad to share a little bit of their experience about how they've experienced conflict and maybe a win that they've experienced or sort of how they're wrestling with it right now. So Nora, why don't you go ahead?
So for us, we kind of defined conflict, or we realized that conflict has a lot to do with self-interest of different groups or constituencies that come up because this is what's important to you and what matters to you. And an example of that came up when we were fighting for the construction impact tax. So the people who had the power to give us what we want, the construction impact tax, was City Council. And our focus was on them. They were kind of our targets, but we were targeting them to get on our side and be our champions and allies and to support legislation, draft legislation, and vote for this thing. But market rate developers, through their trade association, the Building Industry Association, were clearly not our allies because the tax was going to be on them in this fight. And so we needed to figure out how to make sure that they wouldn't stop us, but because of their relationships with the elected officials. So at this time, there was a lot of anger in our city about a policy which gave a 10-year tax abatement on new development. It was needed when it was first enacted to bring market rate developers into our city, but most Philly residents felt that it was no longer needed. And the building industry folks were afraid that people were going to organize to get rid of that abatement. So we negotiated with them that we were going to fight for this, which was less harmful and less hurt their self-interest if they would support our legislation. And they did. They were neutral to supportive, but they were really with us in many ways in the fight. And it was really interesting and fun to work with the Building Industry Association on the same side and have their resources be right next to us, which made a real difference. And it was part of why we won.
Thank you, Nora. Shad, do you want to share a little bit from your experience?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. So with the All in Pittsburgh model, it's based upon everyone being welcome at the table, whether it be philanthropy, organizers, government, residents, and things like that. So the conflict that originally rose was some people were in total disagreement with that model. I remember one individual, he was an organizer, he was saying, Shad, why do you keep expecting me to come to this table when the enemy is sitting directly across the table from me? He was pointing at an individual from the mayor's office. So we were like, oh, wow, this is a great idea conceptually, but we realized that we needed well-facilitated conversations, and we embedded that early on. And another thing is, it's not necessarily a conflict, but it was a challenge. And it was like, how do you have these conversations with individuals that have varying degrees of knowledge, expertise, and points of view? So, we had banks coming to the table early on, but they felt like they didn't really have the time to sit in these problem-solving conversations. They were like, look, we'll come back once you guys figure it out and give us some recommendations. And then, there was dynamics where you had a resident sitting across the table from a developer, and they're like, what's a pro forma? I have no idea what a pro forma is. And, you had individuals that were totally against capitalism, so you're like, how do you, deal with that? And also you had residents where they were just sharing like raw emotion from their lived experience. And you had to give that space and that platform to let them express, their feelings and their emotions. But it's also a challenge to try to harness that into solutions and into policies. So that was one of the challenges, but eventually, we did get legislation passed in the city.
I think on that challenge, as you think back on the experience, you mentioned strong facilitation. Was there anything else that you would point to that really helped you work through to find success? given all of those constraints, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call have experienced similar?
Yeah, I would say this is kind of, but it was just like perseverance, you know, through all that, we just kept meeting, we just kept meeting, we just kept meeting. I would say the appetite for equitable development was really high in Pittsburgh when we started. So we released the report, we had 300 people come. And then as we started meeting, we had a team of about 50. And then like in year 2 or 3, we had a core group of like 25 people that even though we were arguing and stuff like that, they just kept showing up and we worked it out. Now there were still challenges,
Yeah.
of course, but
Yeah.
we just kept meeting and came up with a core group of about 25 people.
That's great. So that definitely supports the embrace the conflict, keep persevering, know you have to circle back. Yeah. Okay, great.
One thing I would say real quick, last is that there was a few individuals who in Pittsburgh who were part of this for community development in Pittsburgh for a long time, and they were like, we've never seen something like this in Pittsburgh, and they were like, guys, this is the bedrock of civic engagement. This is the bedrock of democracy. We can't shortcut our way through this. So those people who are really respected in the neighborhood help pull the group together.
That's powerful. Great. Thank you for sharing that. So Lot, let's go back to you and this question about, you know, you started to share a little bit for us about what you learned from the post-2008 recovery efforts that can really help us now. So can you talk about kind of going forward, what you recommend, or from your experience, what you guys are pursuing?
Sure. We've been, there's 2 levels. I mean, the 2 federal bills that have passed and the 3rd one that is now being battled here in DC, what their focus was on just meeting immediate needs because people lost their income, business lost their income, you know, kind of dealing with just that. And the 3rd one wants to deal with the cities and states version of that. They've lost all tax revenue. And so there lots of debate, a lot of advocacy around those issues because people need that help now, right? The next level of that, there's going to be a point where what people are calling the recovery, I don't know when that's going to start, but at some point the recovery is going to start. And people are thinking about that process now. And what does that look like at a federal level? It means like rebirthing. Well, there's 2 things. The banks and the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were the biggest investors in mortgages, along with FHA, have all put into place, because of the last crisis, processes that they can draw upon. And so hopefully that's going to make outcomes better than it was last time, because they literally have to rebuild that from scratch. But what really worries me is how communication happens, right? And what I've learned from the last crisis is that where it really mattered was how a servicer talked, or the rep, the agent, talking to a family in a local community. And if that message was unclear or used jargon or whatever, a family was as befuddled after the call as they were before the call. And typically they took no action, right? And so all those things are being debated very heavily, both on the communication side, relative to mortgage servicers to borrowers, on the federal agency, rebuilding and reinvigorating programs that are going to avoid families falling through the cracks, right? And then the question after that becomes, as we kind of alluded to before, how many after recovery starts will still have their jobs and can maintain their housing? And that number is not known. Obviously, the concern on our side is that it'll be bigger. It may not be as big as the countless millions, but that happened in the last foreclosure. But typically, it's happening in areas of most vulnerable, which are communities of color and low moderate incomes or communities. So there's a laser focus from many agencies that Mars and others that we collaborate with in DC to make sure, like National Low Income Housing Coalition is another one that we're part of, that is also laser focused on these things, just to maintain the systems, the supports from a federal level, message what should be done at a local level, at least support hopefully a positive message, And I think that's where everybody's focus is. I think the program structures and the program elements that would allow a better outcome this time versus that time, or back in 2008 to 2015, I think the transition from nothing to a really operative supportive system is will happen much faster because of experience and very strong organizations really focused on those things. And I'll add, at a local level, I mean, I've been talking federally, but this stuff plays out locally, and many of you may have experience a local configuration. This one I always remember is one I was involved with was in Richmond, California, near Oakland, where the advocates were lobbying city council to put mandating that, in this case, a specific bank ensured that all their foreclosed homes went to a land bank or a third party that was going to, kind of make use of that property for the benefit of the community. I think, if there's anything I would hope would happen, is that people are really sensitive to that, because those little elements, that one little project created complete waves here in DC, and with the lender community and with the federal agencies. So local activity and local concern about this is hugely important. And so my hope is that some awareness around that, how it plays out in your specific community, would be is something you pay attention to.
That's really a great example, Lot. And I think maybe we'll try to, if we can work with you to try to get a resource around like where people can find information about that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're on the call and you have that experience going on in your community, we'd love to have you put it in the questions or the chat so that we can pool those resources, because there is a lot of energy right now, even before the pandemic, around community land trusts, community ownership, land banks, and the more we can think about how we innovatively mobilize those going forward, the better. So I'm going to turn over to Nora now, because I think, Nora, we talked about you sort of speaking about your experience post 2008, but then also the follow-up question, which is, what do you wish advisors, funders, and researchers knew about doing equitable development on the ground in your job? So maybe kind of thinking about either answer both of those, or I think your answer may be interconnected. So.
Okay, so this is really advice for me as well as for others, but I think it's been very difficult in this time frame to think about the present and the future almost at the same time. And in speaking with a number of our funders and partners, just the present, the pain of the present can take over. But I think Lot's comments and Shad's also remind you that there are some opportunities. In addition to the pain, there's opportunities to ward off future pain. So an example is that we've been contacted by many, many developers, speculators, to try to buy our 300 homes because they're in gentrified neighborhoods and land that we own. About 10 years ago, in 2009, our neighborhood came together to create a community land trust just for the idea of decommodifying, community control, just having some say over what happens in our communities. That community land trust is now citywide, and we've gone to folks to try to raise the money for funding of acquisition and pre-development to get land into community land trusts and community control. And many people have said, wait a minute, not now, this isn't the time for it, but this is the time for it. And so we're trying to figure out how can we ensure, think ourselves creatively about the present, try to support folks in what they need, what all of us need, but especially low income, women with families, women of color, but also think for the future, how can we ensure that we're pushing on policy and decision makers to make sure that, I guess, we're proactive around thinking about the future. And more importantly, you know, we don't let people take over our neighborhoods and our money and our land.
Thank you, Nora. Shad, can you speak to the idea of, you know, as you're thinking about recovery, what do you wish advisors, funders, or researchers understood about equitable development?
I kind of touched on this before, and like I said, the bedrock of it is to make sure that community voice and participation is the centerpiece of equitable development, and that I really underestimated how much work and how much resources is required to do it to a high level. We had a little bit of money with All in Pittsburgh, working with 6 community-based organizations, but we would have meetings during the daytime and no residents would come because they were at work. So we just had to be a little bit more innovative in how we engage communities. Another thing is that sometimes funders would experience that they'll fund community engagement for a short period of time and then that's it. But community engagement resources, it has to be sustained over a long period of time and is vital. And sometimes it's hard to measure, but it's still vital. One promising thing that I saw that we did in the Walmer neighborhood, we really started working with artists to engage communities. So it's okay to be creative in how you engage communities, because there was a huge population of seniors in this one neighborhood, and they didn't want to come to community meetings where there was a lot of killing sessions, if you will. They're like, no, but we needed their voice. So we started working with the artist where he would work with the seniors specifically. He hosts dinners and luncheons for them and began to tell their story. And I participated in those meetings, and you just see the faces of the seniors when they were able to tell their story, and they felt like they were really a part of the conversation. It was awesome. And the other thing that I want to mention now is just how we work through the pandemic, knowing about the digital divide. We did a program here in Pittsburgh. My colleague Stephanie and Vanessa, they started this program. It's called Beyond the Laptop Program, where we found out a lot of people in Pittsburgh, they didn't have laptops and they didn't have internet connection. So we were able to distribute about 1,000 laptops throughout the community. And now we're working on creating more internet access. So as we push through COVID, what does that type of community engagement look like? Eliminating the digital divide.
And I think that example is an important, in this panel, we've really been focusing on land, housing, the way that it affects our individual lives and the trajectory of our communities. But a key part of equitable development is also that people can continue to afford their homes, the small business development, entrepreneurship, the workforce development, education. And so I think, your example about the laptops is a critical piece of, not only do we have to protect affordability, but we have to make sure people have the resources to stay in those homes even when they are affordable. So I think, there are a lot of other conversations happening right now in that space, but I just want to kind of acknowledge that equitable development does have to also include kind of people's livelihoods. So at this point, we've reached the end of our formal questions. And before I start generating questions of things that I'm curious about, I wanted to hand it over to Daniel and see if there are any questions from the audience. And I always would encourage those listening to please do send in your questions. We have somebody, not me, curating those and bringing them to us. So we'd love to be able to engage you all in the conversation further.
So we have thank you, Amy. We have a few questions in response to some of the items that the panelists have brought up. First, I can give you both and then you can kind of decide which we want to go with. So first was really in response to the equity tax on adding an equity tax for development. And the question was kind of, given the different strengths of markets and the different goals of different markets, how do you work with people to balance equity as a priority while also trying to attract new investments into the area for new development? So that was question number one. The second question was what Shad was just kind of hitting at right now was how are you all doing community engagement? How are you looking into bringing the community into your work before COVID-19 and also now, during the social distancing and the mostly virtual world we're dealing in? So that's what we got right now.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
Yeah.
So let's tackle the first question, and I will paraphrase it to what I heard in that question was, some communities have hot markets, and a construction tax is going to be really effective. Some communities may have weak markets, and what to consider, and then also there's some in between, and that's probably where I'm the most interested in your response, maybe Nora and Lot, from your experience. But feel free to answer it as you think, but maybe start with Nora since you're the one that brought up the construction tax.
Okay. So I think in general, it's hard to establish your credibility if you come from a low-income community or a community where you're mostly women and kids or people of color. And so we have to be really careful when we're doing a campaign to do our homework and our research. Usually we partner up with an academic institution or a research institution. But for the particular construction impact tax, we wanted to have the most conservative research institution work with us because we knew if they put out information about the rate at which we wanted to tax, they would have, people would believe them because they were always hired by the development community. So we worked with a firm that was local to us called eConsult that taught me about something that probably people on this webinar know about, but I did not know about, which were our elasticity rates and all kinds of things that we'd never heard about. Our job, I guess this leads into the next question. Our job is always for people to be able to use their voice to speak their own story about what they need related to affordable housing or land, but put that in the context of the data so that they can also speak to, and my brothers and sisters or everyone in, this is the percent of need in your district, Mr. or Ms. Politician. So people aren't just speaking what they know, they're putting in the context of the data. So demystifying the data and the solution that comes up to the problem and the cost of not addressing the problem is all a part of, I think, that second question of how people are engaged. So there's a lot of, I guess, training for all of us. You know, the researchers have to be trained in what we do know and what we don't know, and our perspective and what we do know in the neighborhoods. And then we learn also what the researchers think and then come up with something that is very strong to speak to our electeds.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lot, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. I think another thing that I think is more clear to, broadly speaking, and that maybe this debated, but equity is a problem, right? The disparities in income, disparity in the wealth, you know, how much is that talked about daily? I mean, everybody knows it's a problem at some level. Whether you care about it's another thing, but a lot of people are aware of the problem. So when all these issues for me is there, because of that, people are struggling. There's a lot of effort, a lot of great work trying to make sure that people understand the implications of that. And I know in any community, any fight like that, whether it's you want new development or you want to, and therefore open up markets and with very little restriction, or you want to ensure equitable development by incorporating that piece into policy, right? Nobody's ever going to be happy fully. Right. And so I think the issue, our approach to it has been, or my approach in thinking, and in some of the areas we've been working on, I said, listen, you know, nobody's going to be totally happy, but the issue of why it's important for the long term, why it's better for the country, why it's better for the region, how spreading income more broadly strengthens the economy. It doesn't weaken the economy. All those elements have to be brought to bear. And then relative to, so just as a theoretical place, I think that's what I would say how we approach this. And then secondly, the other part on local, we obviously are national organizations, so it's not something we do a lot, but we do a lot of local partnering. And let's say Nora's comments on some of the elements, some of the key strategies, some of the sensibilities that our local partners bring to the work is equally critical. And in our case, particularly the Latino communities is a community that's both vilified and needed, right? And so it presents kind of interesting questions for us to kind of, first of all, mobilize that community, and then raise the voice sufficiently that people in power will care. So, you know, LA is not a problem because the Latino population is so great. But North Carolina, many elements of North Carolina is a huge problem, right? And so all those kinds of things have to be factored in as you think about community engagement, and essentially presenting information or providing information to communities so they can more effectively fight for what they need to and they think is critical for their community.
Thank you. Shad, do you want to add anything related to either question? So the first question being about, yeah, go ahead.
No, so I would just say that as a community development intermediary, we're kind of 2 steps removed from the lives of everyday residents and the pain they were feeling. So we relied heavily on the relationships we have at the neighborhood level with the community-based organizations. So we had to adapt and adjust very quickly. So we had this one grant program that we had to just shift about $100,000 to this, we call it the CARE package. It was the COVID accelerated relief effort, where the community-based organizations were just supplying food, masks, supplies, and things like that. I mean, that's what we were hearing. Another thing, I mentioned the laptop program. We were like, hey, you know, people need internet access laptops. So we were able to form partnerships and get those laptops deployed. Another thing that we heard really quickly is that small businesses and even nonprofits were having a very hard time accessing the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP from the federal government. So we were able to form a relationship with First Commonwealth Bank and some of our other partners to help our small businesses to fill out the application and get a fast track into those funds. So that was pretty successful. We were able to help about 15 businesses and access about $1 million from our program. And we're going to still continue to work with them to make sure that they get those loans forgiven and paid off. The last thing that we did was we created this, it's called the GO-GO program. It's called Get Online and Grow Online, to help our small businesses with e-commerce, you know, to promote and market their business online and also to make financial transactions online. And we only had about like $15,000 for that program right now. We're able to, you know, service about 50 businesses, but the demand is huge. So we're in the process right now of getting more resources to help out those small businesses. And I would say what we're also thinking about is kind of like post-COVID, like what does community development look like with a public health lens? And, you know, merging public health, community development, and artists as far as community engagement. So we're just really scratching the surface on that right now.
Thank you, Shad. Daniel, I think we have time for one more question, if there's one.
Yeah. So we have one question. I'm just going to go ahead and read it verbatim here. So a CLT can promote equitable land development, but also limits growth of equity families, or equity that families can take out of their homes. So the question was really, what are ways to build family wealth other than through increasing home equity?
It's an important tension. Who wants to jump in?
Better jobs. I mean, the thing is that wealth comes from rents in some form. So it's like if you own a home, it increases in value. Essentially, it's a form of income for you as a homeowner. And the reason it's been a popular way is because you're doing it while you have a place to live and you're just conducting your family life within the confines. The other ways, it's a proverbial question, because to do other types of investment, you have to have money over and above the basic needs of food, housing, and health. And so I've not found a way to do that without more income. And so what does more income look like? More income could be small business, it could be job development, it could be more education for some families, some individuals. But the point really is that additional delta between absolutely necessary costs and the ability to put some of that away into another thing, what are some popular ones, 401ks or retirement plans that they may have available to them, you know, college savings programs, 529s and some other things like that. And so in essence, there's a way to build wealth that way, but I think it's really tied to this income equation for that individual or family.
Yeah, I don't know if this answers the question, but the homes that we have built are leased up to families, and our initial tenants earn between $8,000 and $13,000. And within 4 years, the average income of a tenant is $20,000. So when someone's coming from a rental or being doubled and tripled up, when they're finally in safe, affordable housing, they have an opportunity to move forward in their lives. we're doing our first home ownership project. We've done some lease purchase with using tax credit development equity, but we're building in a neighborhood that was 99% African American. 35% of the African Americans are not in that neighborhood today since the last census because of gentrification. People can't stay in the neighborhood. Their kids can't buy in the neighborhood. The average house in the neighborhood is $500,000. We were able to get land for free through organizing and build homes for $300,000. We raised $150 in subsidy, and we can sell to people at 80% of AMI, or roughly a little bit less than $70,000 for income. But they can buy a house for $150,000 across from $500,000 houses. So when we talk about equity, it really matters where you're starting and how long it takes you to get to the next place. So if that sounds defensive, I'm sorry.
No, I think that's
really quickly, sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to build on that, a neighborhood organization that we're working with that's deploying a CLT, they're really looking at that as a strategy for stabilization and to help some of their tenants that were living in deplorable properties and again, some getting displaced. So they saw the CLT as a great way to help folks to become more stabilized and then provide wraparound services, whether boosting your credit score, help them connect to job training opportunities where if they wanted to move into different home ownership, they could do that. And I know a lot of individuals are fighting for fair, livable wages. So many of our residents are stuck in, jobs that are paying less than $15 an hour, no benefits, things like that. So I think that has to be a huge part of the conversation.
Thank you, Shad. It's very helpful. So I think it's 1:52. I think it's probably good. We'll do a little bit of a wrap up and a summary. Maybe since we have a few extra minutes, panelists, is there any final thought you want to share before I give some final thoughts? You don't need to. You guys have shared so much wisdom. I know you don't, I know you all, from talking with you, are very humble people, but it's been wonderful to hear your experiences and ideas. So, I'll share a few things that stood out to me, trying to wrap up some of the things we're talking about. Going back to some of those common themes that we started with, the importance of really right now. Most of the people that are on the call, I'm sure, are thinking about, okay, there's so much need. How do I focus? How do I decide? Where do I invest? How do I prioritize? I think the idea of organizing and fighting to protect the things you've already won, critical. Thinking about how to retain and increase local control. So whether that be community ownership of the land, whether that be worker cooperatives, whether that be figuring out solutions like having more ability of what you do on your own property with the additional units, development units, and then also thinking about how you can work through the conflict and persevere in this time. In response to the last question, what really stood out to me that we really haven't talked about, but is such a pivotal underpinning for community development, is you have to be grounded in the immediate needs and the needs of your community. And so, what is the right strategy is somewhat dependent on, as we've talked about, listening to our residents. Thinking about, Nora, I appreciated your mention of finding an expert that really is going to help you ground in the data and figure out what is the right policy or button to push right now, given where your market is at, where your residents at, whatever the largest priority is. And thinking about also where you have found success and how do you build on that. We all start from a particular place. We are going to be pulling together resources for you all, as Daniel mentioned. So if there's something in particular that was really exciting or interesting, or you wanted to know more about it, please share that in the questions and we'll make sure to do our best to share that with you. In the bios are the panelist email addresses. They are all willing to answer questions or engage and speak with you about what's happening in your community. And I think that's all I have. So We are very excited to have been able to share this time with you. I do wish that I could see all of you that are attendees, and I'm pretty sure the panelists feel the same way. But we're grateful to have been on this journey, and we hope to continue the conversation. And maybe Daniel, looks like maybe you have a few things you want to say at the end.
Yeah, just again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We had about 112 people, so that was wonderful. And just to all let you know, we do have another webinar coming up on May 28th. For anyone who may have an equity plan in the organization or is working on an equity plan, titled "You Have an Equity Plan. Now what?" And also, you can feel free to continue this conversation with us by joining communitiesrespond.net, which is really a website that we put together to start to bring community organizers together to share resources and potentially start to collaborate together. And as well as any more questions regarding the webinar or anything else, info@communityscience.com. Get right to me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Good job, everyone. I think it's over, right?